Good morning. We're about ready to begin reading the great adventures of Blinky Bill. We'll start in chapter 1. It's titled The New Arrival. The bush was alive with excitement. Mrs. Koala had a brand new baby, and the news spread like wildfire. The kookaburras, a very special bird in Australia, in the highest gum trees heard of it, and they laughed and they chuckled at the idea. In and out of their burrows, the rabbits came scuttling with their big brown eyes opening wide with wonder as they heard the news. Over the grass the message went, where Mrs. Kangaroo was quietly hopping towards her home. She fairly leapt in the air with joy. "I must tell Mr. Kangaroo!" And she cried and bounded away in great hops and leaps. Even Mrs. Snake, who was having a nap, awoke and gave a wiggle and blinked her wicked little eyes. The whole bushland was twiddling with the news, for a baby bear was a great event. Mrs. Koala had a baby every 2 years. And as Mrs. Rabbit had many during that time, you can just imagine how surprised everyone was for the koala to be born. In the fork of a gum tree far above the ground, Mrs. Koala nursed her baby, peeping every now and then at the tiny creature in her pouch. This little baby was the funniest wee creature. He was only about an inch long and covered with soft baby fur, had 2 big ears compared to the size of the rest of him, and a tiny black nose and 2 beady eyes. His mother and father always had a surprised look on their faces, but they looked more surprised than ever now as they gazed at their baby. He peeped at them and blinked, as much as to say, "Aren't you glad I'm here?" Mrs. Koala puffed her cheeks with pride, and her husband hugged her baby tight. And there was quite a lot of quarreling and jealousy among the bush folk as to who would be the baby's nurse. Mrs. Kookaburra was the first to offer her services, and she came flying over the tree where the koalas lived. Knocking on the tree with her strong beak, she asked if she might come in. "Certainly, Mrs. Bear," said Mrs. Bear, "if you don't laugh and wake the baby up." "Do you want a nurse for him?" Mrs. Kookaburra anxiously inquired. "Yes, I do," Mrs. Bear replied. "What will I do?" Mrs. Kookaburra asked. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Bear. "Your laugh is so loud and your chuckle so long that you'll wake the baby up." Poor Mrs. Kookaburra was very disappointed and flew off to tell Mrs. Magpie about it. Imagine Mrs. Koala's surprise as she peeped down the tree later on and saw Mrs. Snake slowly wiggling her way up. Oh, she was frightened. "Go away, Mrs. Snake," she called in a loud voice. "I've come to nurse the baby. Mrs. Magpie sent me." And Mrs. Snake wiggled higher up in the tree, right onto the branch where Mrs. Koala sat, and coiled herself around the fork of the tree. "I don't want a nurse." And the poor frightened Mrs. Bear tried to push the baby's head back into the pouch, but he would peep out. "Ah, he's a nice little fella, and like his daddy," said Mrs. Snake slyly. "I can take him along on my back for such lovely rides, up and down trees and in and out big black holes." Hearing this, Mrs. Bear nearly fell off the tree with fright and began to cry. Now, Mr. Koala had been listening to Mrs. Snake as he sat on a branch just around the corner. Slowly he climbed over to Mrs. Snake, caught her in his claws, and before anyone had the time to see what was happening, he pushed her off the branch and she went tumbling down to the ground below. 2 very frightened bears peeped down from the tree, and there they saw Mrs. Snake slowly crawling away in the grass. Now, they were just beginning to recover from this frightful experience when a thump, thump, thump was heard on the ground at the foot of the tree. "Who's there?" called Mrs. Bear in a very frightened voice. "It's just me," came the reply. "Who's me?" growled Mr. Bear. "Angelina Wallaby." Wallabies are small kangaroos. "Come on up," Mrs. Bear replied. "I can't climb." My tail is all wrong, said Angelina. Well, then, I guess I could climb down if Mrs. Snake is nowhere about. And she slowly started to scramble down the tree. Very carefully she went, always grasping the tree with her strong claws, her back showing all the time, while she cleverly looked over her shoulder every now and then to see that all was safe below. It took her quite a long time to reach the ground, and she was very nervous. Now, Angelina Wallaby hopped over to her and gazed in wonderment at the baby. What a dear little fellow, she said, her great big brown eyes round with excitement. At the same time, she put her paws out to touch him. Oh, don't, said Mrs. Bear. He's so small and your nails could possibly hurt him. I've been all morning blunting them on stones so that I could pat him, said Angelina in a disappointed voice. Oh, I'm sorry, said Mrs. Bear. I did not mean to be rude, but Mrs. Snake gave me such a fright. I'll be ever so gentle, said Angelina, but if you let me pat him, I'll just do it one time. Very well, smiled Mrs. Bear as she opened up her pouch. Angelina Wallaby patted him twice and then sniffed him all over with her soft, muzzly nose. Now her eyelashes caught his little toes, but Angelina did not mind, as she herself had babies and knew just what to do. I wish I could mind him for sometimes, Mrs. Bear. I'll be so gentle with him. I'm sure you would be the very kindest nurse, replied Mrs. Bear. But what could you do for him? Oh, I could come along in the evenings and take him out for a walk. I have a pouch just like yours. I could tuck him in and hop along very gently so he wouldn't feel the bumps. I think that is a good idea, said Mrs. Bear. So it was arranged that Mrs. Bear would climb down every evening and meet Angelina Wallaby, who would take the baby for a walk in the bush. Imagine how proud Angelina felt. She hopped home very quickly that evening to tell her friends the news. Next day, as the sun was setting, she came to the foot of the gum tree and thumped 3 times on the ground with her tail. Mrs. Bear peeped around the corner and, seeing Angelina at the foot of the tree, called out, I'm coming down with the baby, so watch for Mrs. Snake. Then she carefully and slowly climbed to the bottom of the tree. Is the coast clear? She anxiously asked. Yes, said Mrs. Bear. Yes, Mrs. Bear. I passed Mrs. Snake on the road a mile away. Well, do be careful, Angelina. Bring him back before the day breaks. Is your pouch warm? And Mrs. Bear inspected Angelina's pouch. Yes, Mrs. Bear. It might be a trifle large, so I patted it well with grass, but it's very warm and not a bit draughty. So the baby was carefully taken from the mother's pouch and gently placed in Angelina's. Waving a paw to Mrs. Bear, she hopped and peeped down at the baby to see what he thought of it. Taking several more hops, she soon started away for the bush track and in no time came to Mrs. Rabbit's house. Thumping her tail on the ground, she waited for a moment. Mrs. Rabbit popped her head out of the burrow. Good evening, Mrs. Rab. I brought the baby to show you. Good gracious, how lovely, said Mrs. Rabbit as Angelina gently drew the baby from her pouch. Several more bunnies came around to inspect the new arrival. Just look at his ears, cried Mrs. Rabbit. I'm sure I would never hear a thing with those fairy ears. Oh dear, he has no tail. Oh well, take care that he does not catch cold. I really think he should have a tail to keep him warm. You know what? I have a spare one hanging around on the wall of the burrow. Poor Mr. Rabbit was shot a long time ago, and I found his tail. Here, Mrs. Rabbit burst into tears at that point. Oh, never mind, my dear, said Angelina soothingly. If it would please you, we could tie the tail on the baby. Mrs. Rabbit dried her eyes with her paw and went sniffling down into the burrow. I won't but be a moment, she called out from somewhere under the ground. Up she came in a very short time, carrying the tail in her 2 front paws. What can we sew it with? inquired Angelina. We'll tie it with a piece of grass. And Mrs. Rabbit hopped around until she found a nice long piece. Here's just the thing, she cried, and came hopping back with it in her teeth. Angelina excitingly pulled the baby out of her pouch, and together they fastened the tail on. It did look funny, for it was almost as long as the baby, but it certainly would keep him warm. Bidding her friend good night, she hopped on her way. The moon was now shining brightly, and all the bush was hushed, except for the sound of little animals who were always busy at nighttime. Angelina sniffed the night air with delight and felt very happy as she thought of the baby in her pouch. Hopping along between the great gum trees, she suddenly was startled to see Mrs. Snake lying right across her pathway. "Ha, ha, ha, Mrs. Wallaby," called the wicked Mrs. Snake. "So you're the baby's nurse. Well, I want to take a look at him." "Oh, you can't," cried Angelina. "He'll catch cold if I take him out of my pouch." "Oh, he won't. The night is warm," said Mrs. Snake. "Show him to me at once." Angelina thought very quickly, and darting her paws into her pouch, she untied the rabbit's tail and pulled it out. "Here you are, Mrs. Snake. Isn't he beautiful?" Mrs. Snake did not even stop to look. She sprang at the tail and bit it savagely. "Ha, ha, ha," she laughed. "There will be no baby to take home now." Poor Angelina got such a fright, she did not waste a moment, but hopped away as fast as her legs could carry her. And on she went, breathless with fear, not daring to look behind. She reached the foot of the gum tree and thumped wildly with her tail. Mrs. Bear came scurrying down and listened to the story. Then quickly grabbing her baby, she quickly climbed to safety. Angelina waited at the foot of the tree until she saw Mrs. Bear safely home, and then hopped away to the bushland. After that, Mrs. Koala decided to keep her baby at home. Now, when he was 8 months old, he could no longer crawl into the snug pouch. Not at all. So his baby days were over. He became very cunning, too. When his mother was feeding, he learned to stretch out his arms and pull the tenderest leaves into his mouth. He soon reached the age of 1 and measured 10 inches, while his weight was about 3 pounds. Strange as it seemed, Mrs. Koala had not thought of a name for her baby. Now she thought it was quite the time for him to be christened or named. So one day she talked about the matter over with his father. "Shall we call him Walter or Blue Gum?" she inquired. "No," grunted Mr. Koala. "Let's call him Billy Blinky or Blinky Bill." So Blinky Bill became his name from that moment on. "Well, my dear, I'll arrange about the christening," said Mrs. Koala. "My cousin, the minister Fluffy Ears, will perform the ceremony, and of course we must choose his godfather, and his godmother." "Jacko Kookaburra will be his godfather," said Mr. Bear. "We'll send him a message over the wireless so that he will hear it. And Angelina Wallaby was sure to jump with joy if we asked her to be the godmother." The great day arrived. In a quiet corner of the bush, down by the little stream, surrounded with bells and flannel flowers, everyone came far and near to see the young Bill christened. The minister, Fluffy Ears, looked very important. He held in his paws a book of gum leaves from which he read. Mr. and Mrs. Koala smiled at everyone, and everyone smiled at Blinky Bill. Jacko looked spick and span, and of course, being a widely traveled gentleman, he took things very quietly. At the same time, he gave a dig in the ground with his beak every now and then and swallowed a fat worm. Angelina looked so sweet in her nut brown coat, and her large eyes watched Blinky Bill all the time. She had made a ball of fur for him to play with, and he cuddled and hugged it closely at all times. Mrs. Rabbit rang the bells, and everyone sat down or perched. The minister Fluffy Ears spoke as he took Blinky Bill in his arms. "What shall I name this young bear?" he asked. "Blinky Bill," said Mrs. Koala and Mr. Koala. At once the bush was filled with laughter. Wild kookaburras, who were no relationship to Jacko, had flown in from a nearby tree, and they made a terrible din, chuckling and laughing at the top of their voices, and no one could speak for the noise. "Silence!" roared the minister Fluffy Ears. But it was useless. They took no notice. "I'll speak to those young larrikins," said Jacko, and he gave a call for all to listen. Immediately the laughter ceased. "I'm Jacko," he said, "and if you birds up there don't keep quiet, I will tell everyone over the radio what rude kookaburras you are and that you are no relationship to me." Jacko was such a wonderful bird that they had good reasons to keep quiet. The ceremony ended without any more interruptions. He was carried home again, Blinky Bill, on his mother's back, feeling very important after all the fuss and petting. That night in the fork of the young gum trees, Mrs. Koala told him that he was now a youth, and that if he was a human being, he would have to put knickerbockers on, which are a type of shorts. So that's the chapter. That's chapter 1. And my encouragement at this time, parents, is for you to spend time with your children and ask them what they thought was really neat, what thoughts they were scary. Maybe asking which characters were good and which characters were not so good. Another thought would be, ask your children, do they know other stories about a snake who was sly and deceptive, just like Mrs. Snake was in here? And maybe they'll think of the story of Adam and Eve as well. So those are things we can do. I hope you had a good time reading this chapter. We'll do chapter 2 in the near future. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.